Hello, welcome. My name is Ruth Colazar-Green. I am a faculty member in the School of Social Work, as well as the President's Advisor on Indigenous Initiatives. I want to welcome you here today to our Indigenous Peoples Day discussion, where we will be entitled Black and Indigenous Communities Living in Solidarity, Recognizing Intersectionality on Indigenous Peoples Day. First, I'd like to acknowledge that this gathering is virtual and we are not all gathered in the same area, in the same space. I recognize that this land acknowledgement might not be for the territory that you're currently on. We ask that if this is the case, you take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territories that you are on and the current treaty holders. As a member of the York University community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississauga, the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lake regions. It is now a great pleasure and honor for me to introduce our first speaker. Madison is a 9-year-old Ojibwe Martin clan from the Adak-Omi Aoke Nation. Madison likes to dance and sing. Miigwech. Madison will be sharing an art piece with us that represents a plant. She created a strawberry tree and instructions on how to grow it. Madison?
Madison started this art piece. You can see her strawberry tree.
Madison, can you speak up, sweetie?
Did you hear her?
She's very quiet. Could we?
Okay, can you hear me when I talk?
Yes.
Okay, so this is how to grow Madison's strawberry tree. So she needs water, she needs sunshine, she needs clean air, she needs kind words. Sing to me, she needs visitors. Pray to the strawberry tree. Those are her words. She thought about how to grow her tree and how she's going to grow as a person.
Thank you so much, Madison. We do need to remember that we have a responsibility to take care of you and to take care of all Black Indigenous children, as you are the heart of our community. And that's what I understand the strawberry to mean, is that it's that heartberry, that the very center of our teachings. And, you know, the responsibility of caring for you is very foundational to our roles as aunties and as community members. So thank you for sharing how to grow you. I promise to give you light and love and water. Thank you, my friend. I'd also like now to introduce Vice President Sheila Cote Meeks, Vice President of Equity, People, and Culture here at York University. Sheila?
Thank you, Ruth, for that. And Miigwech Madison for the teachings of the strawberry and for sharing your diagram with us. Bojo, Kwekwe, Ani, warm greetings. Semakwe Dishnakas, Makwadodem, Temigama Anishinaabe. I'm really pleased to be here today to recognize National Indigenous Peoples Day. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing the dialogue with Doctors Andrea Davis and Bonita Lawrence. It's a special privilege to hear them both speak. I'd like to take a few minutes to talk a little bit about the history and significance of National Indigenous Peoples Day. In 1982, now 38 years ago, it was the National Indian Brotherhood, now called the Assembly of First Nations, that called for the creation of National Aboriginal Solidarity Day. In 1995, some 13 years later, a sacred assembly, a national conference of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people chaired by Elijah Harper, called for the national holiday to celebrate contributions of Indigenous people. Again, in 1995, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples recommended the designation of National Peoples Day. National Aboriginal Day, now called National Indigenous Peoples Day, was announced in 1996 by the then Governor General of Canada, Romeo LeBlanc, through a proclamation declaring June 21st of each year as National Aboriginal Day. And on June 21st, 2017, the Prime Minister issued a statement announcing the intention to rename this day to what it is now called today, National Indigenous Peoples Day. A day to recognize and to celebrate the distinct contributions and cultures of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, and importantly, also to acknowledge their contributions to this country. June 21st was actually chosen because of its cultural significance of the summer solstice, the first day of summer and the longest day of the year. And because many Indigenous peoples mark this day as a time to celebrate their own heritage. In my own view, setting aside a day to recognize and celebrate the achievements and contributions of Indigenous people is critical in terms of the wider recognition of Indigenous peoples' important place within the fabric of Canada as First Peoples of this land. At York University, we have the Indigenous Framework, which lays out 10 key principles that guide the development of the work that we do here, including, for example, the work at increasing the number of Indigenous faculty, expanding the curriculum so that it's more inclusive, facilitating research that is relevant and responsive to the needs of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities, as well as the recent approval of an Indigenous Research Center slated to open next year. We look forward to continuing to respond to the aspirations and needs of Indigenous peoples and working with our Indigenous Council. It's also, for me, an important reminder of the work that still remains. For example, I just want to highlight a few things. There's still many Indigenous communities that still don't have clean drinking water. Many of the calls from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 actions have still gone unanswered. There's been no federal response to the MMIW report. And the UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, while adopted, has not really been followed. So I encourage everyone to take some time to inform themselves about the history, the culture, and tradition of Indigenous peoples in Canada. Today's event promises to be educative and informative as Doctors Lawrence and Davis discuss how Indigenous and Black communities are working together to support one another, but importantly, they will discuss the intersectionalities of those identities. So Miigwech, merci, thank you for joining us here today. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Sheila. It's a great pleasure for me to be able to introduce two brilliant women who have both cared and supported me as a young Indigenous academic, two people who I can trust and rely on to understand and support Indigenous communities, and they are the epitome of making space and pulling room ahead for people. They mentor and they support. I'm very fortunate to be able to have our Vice President, Sheila Cote-Meeks, who's also done that work for me. So I thank you, Sheila, so much for all that you have done for Indigenous community members and Indigenous academics across this country, and for inspiring and holding us up. And now as we move into this conversation, I look at Angela and Benita, two people I trust and engage with regularly. It's a great honor to have you both here. First, Dr. Benita Lawrence is both Mi'kmaq and English background. She is a full professor in Indigenous Studies at York University. She's the author of 2 academic books, Real Indians and Others, Mixed Race, Urban Native People and the Indigenous Nationhood, and Fractured Homelands, Federal Recognition and the Algonquin Identity in Ontario. She lives in Eastern Ontario on 100 acres of forested land that, with a lake that's gradually being reduced to a beaver swamp, a massive garden, family members, 2 dogs, and of course, a cat. Dr. Andrea Davis is an associate professor in Black culture of the Americas and coordinator of the Black Canadian Studies Certificate. She's the chair of the Department of Humanities at York University. She holds a cross appointment with the graduate programs in English, interdisciplinary studies, gender feminist, and women's studies. Her research focuses on the literary production of Black women in the Americas. She's particularly interested in the intersections of literature of the Caribbean, the United States, and Canada, and her work encourages an intertextual cross-cultural dialogue about Black women's experience in the diaspora. She is the author of a forthcoming book, Horizons, Sea and Sound, the Post-Diaspora Critique of the Nation. Welcome, both Professor Lawrence and Davis. Did you come both on? Did we get that? I'm always like tech.
Say go, Ruth.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, so as discussed, I've developed a few questions that I get to ask the mentors, the brilliant women ahead of me, to respond to, and it's kind of a pleasure and an honor. So I'm just going to ask a few questions. As we discussed, there is not a lot of time for Q&A, so we've decided not to engage that, but want to acknowledge that this is a time to listen and learn and reflect, and that we ask participants who do have questions to hold those questions, keep those questions, and do some learning for yourself. That these are times and spaces where Indigenous community members and Black community members I'm overtaxing them, asking them to do this, but it's a space where we're asking people to do their own reflection and to take on some of that learning. So we're not going to do a Q&A so that we can hear as much as we can from Professor Lawrence and Davis. So one of the startings of this discussion that uncovered the reason and need for an event was a beautifully worded statement that you two co-wrote together and posted on your individual programs. So I'm going to read the statement, and then I would like you to talk about how it came about and why it's important that Black and Indigenous people stand together. So the statement for everyone reads: the Indigenous Studies Program and the Black Canadian Studies Certificate stand in solidarity with those protesting the murder of George Floyd, as well as the families of 3 Indigenous people murdered in Winnipeg by the police within the past few days. 16-year-old Aisha Hudson, 17-year-old James Addo, and Jason Collins, a 30-year-old father of 3, as well as those grieving Regina Korchinski-Paquette, a 29-year-old Afro-Indigenous woman who died a week ago now, 3 weeks ago, in Toronto. We know the strong connection between rampant anti-Black racism and colonialism that allows the murders of Indigenous people to continue with such impunity. We call on York to address the connection between colonialism and anti-Black racism. Can you tell us how this statement came to be and why it's important?
I actually wrote the statement, for the most part, in outrage after 3 Native people were murdered by the police in less than 10 days in Winnipeg, and that this was not part of the national response to the murder of George Floyd. And in some ways, I wanted to highlight both the incredible scale and the routine nature of the murders of Indigenous peoples in Canada, whether we're talking about shooting deaths in summer or starlight tours in winter. And starlight tours didn't start with the Stonechild Inquiry in the 1990s. I was out there in Western Canada in 1973, and people were talking about them then. I think that the taking of Native men out outside the city and dumping them in below zero weather without a coat or shoes or any clothes really has been going on for 50 years or more. And the fact that the highest percentage of murders by the police in the US are actually of Native Americans. But we have to bear in mind that the much larger numbers of Black people in the US means that while the percentage of them murdered may be lower than that of Native peoples, the actual numbers are much, much higher. But these murders of Native people seldom reach the mainstream, both because they so often take place outside of urban centers, and that in both Canada and the United States, Native peoples are simply considered to be irrelevant for the most part, an aberration from the mainstream. While in many parts of Canada where Native people form large percentages of the population, the rhetoric is that Native people live such high-risk lives as alcoholics, as street people, as sex trade workers, as the stereotypes go, that regardless of who actually is murdered, that their deaths are in a sense justifiable. As the Cree poet Greg Schofield said of how his mother was seen by so many people in Western Canada, they saw what all their parents saw, that Indian women her age were walking corpses scrounging for a drink. I feel the poem redeems, challenges that vision. So I don't want to end on those words, but I thought it was important. And then the sheer scale of the routine murders of Black men and women, which has brought about such a heightened focus on anti-Black racism. I wanted a means of addressing both sets of realities, the intensity and scale of Native murders in Canada, along with the ongoing murders of Black people by the police. And the recent cases 73 years ago where the police beat a man to death, a Black man to death in Bordeaux jail. That has just become, known to us. This has been going on for decades in Canada. So, and I showed this to Andrea, and Andrea thought that it was quite powerful and agreed that Indigenous and Black people had to be focused on together. So she wanted to endorse it by the Black Canadian Studies certificate. And I thought that that was really important as a means of it's just as important as having Indigenous peoples recognize that Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, I mean, for me, in the wake of George Floyd's death and the protests that erupted across the United States and the world more generally, it was important that the university's senior administration issue a meaningful statement denouncing anti-Black racism, as well as acknowledging the contours of white supremacy more generally and the systemic racism that operates at the institutional levels of higher education. And many of us were disappointed by the initial statement, the university's initial statement, and felt that we needed to push the university to be more honest, to be more self-reflexive, and to name concrete ways in which it was prepared to not only acknowledge, but also to identify concrete strategies that it could use to respond to challenges faced by Black communities, not only outside the university, but by students, faculty, and staff within the institution itself. And so when Bonita came to me with this statement, I thought that the opportunity to issue a joint statement was a really powerful moment of solidarity that brought together, right, Indigenous and Black faculty and allowed us to stand together in a really public and unique way, you know, in ways that we don't often do or we don't do enough, in a call for shared justice and in a call to hold our university accountable. For me, it was also a way to highlight, though, that it's not enough for the university to say, right, we're advancing Indigenous reconciliation and are therefore addressing the historical effects of Canadian racism while ignoring the deeply painful and traumatic experiences of Black people. And so that juxtaposition was also important for me, that we needed to find ways that we could, that if we're going to really effect meaningful, widespread institutional change, we can't just focus on one, you know, one small area that becomes important because the federal government, for example, says so, while freeing us not to, you know, to avoid or to ignore other inequities. And which for me suggests a kind of tokenism and an unwillingness to really participate in change. And I don't think that it needs to be that way. And so for me to stand with Bonita, that was my way of both holding all of us accountable, but standing with her as my friend and as my colleague to say that you know, we recognize the intersections of each other's hurt and pain.
And this is a broader conversation than, you know, just one university, one space. It is an intersectional conversation that goes beyond that. And I think it's very important that we start those conversations, because when we talk about Black and Indigenous people, there's many mechanisms that colonial structures use in an attempt to maintain those distinct identities. How would you both want to speak to those, maintaining of Black identities and Indigenous identities as distinct and not in conjunction or solidarity?
Again, I'll start first. I think for Indigenous peoples, the Indian Act has played a tremendous role in erasing the diversity of Indigenous peoples' histories through removal from the land, massive attacks on language, and basically our identities in residential school, and its accompanying erosion of the connections between families and communities. So after all these losses, for many of my generation and those who are younger, the only thing that defines our indigeneity in an urban setting is Indian status or its lack. And we police each other through who has or does not have Indian status, what kind of status, questions of band membership, etc. Now, I certainly am not denying that we are in the middle of cultural resurgence as well as Indigenous peoples, and that many, many other facets of our identities are being recalled and remade. But I think that this focus has erased much of our history, including the histories of our relations historically with Indigenous people, with Black people, most notably the strong evidence of relationships, the existence of extensive trade networks between the peoples of Africa and the peoples of the Americas well before Columbus. That's really well established, and yet it's erased, right? And another problem is, I think, the way our histories have been written. For over a century, white anthropologists and historians defined what Native histories are and aren't. I mean, again, that is changing, but that has had its imprint. And Black people are nowhere in these histories. And yet in the Maritimes, the only places where the longevity of Black history in Canada has enabled really long-term interrelations between Mi'kmaq and Black people. I'm not talking, I mean, there are huge contemporary relations between Native and Black people, a lot of intermarriage going on. But the longevity of relationships in the Maritimes is unique in Canada. And around there, Black and Native peoples know that they're relatives, you know, that. So that gets sort of written out of the picture of how we are seen. Another problem has been how Black history in the rest of Canada outside of the Maritimes has been written in ways that erases Native people. In fact, most Black people settled in regions across Canada on land that was only recently under treaty. So Native people were always there, and by erasing Native presence, it's erased their interrelationships. The example I've used before in my writing is a couple from North Carolina who arrived in Canada in February and moved immediately into what was called the Queen's Bush. And is immediately put up a sort of a teepee, as they put it, out of wooden slats. Now, to arrive from North Carolina in February and move into, you know, the Southern Ontario bush, as it was then, they had to have learned survival skills from Native people. But that gets erased. That history that must have been there of friendships and survival sharing between Native people and Black people at the time. And of course, at the time, for many Native people, Black people learned skills under slavery that they didn't have, and they relied on as well. So that early history gets erased because of the way that traditionally Black history was written as well, you know. Now, the one thing I'm really happy about is that the disciplinary hiving off of Indigenous and Black studies is finally being breached. So that, for example, the interrelationships of slavery and colonialism are being explored. However, the role I think that the trade in Native slaves played in establishing plantation slavery in the southern US is not yet well understood. That mass enslavement and export of Indigenous peoples was a much more effective means of clearing the land so that plantation slavery could be enabled. So genocide then included mass exports of Indigenous peoples up and down the east coast of the Americas for a number of years. And this is something that really needs to be considered and of course that Native people were enslaved with Black people without in any way addressing the really distinct things of the Atlantic slave trade. And I guess the theorizing, maybe Andrea, if you can take up from here, you know, this little intro.
Thank you so much, Bonita. And at the beginning, I should have said thank you, Ruth, for inviting me to be a part of this conversation and being able to share with Bonita, who I respect very, very much. For me, one of the biggest problems with overcoming, right, the ways in which colonial structures and narratives divide and set at odds the goals and desires of Black and Indigenous peoples has to do with a kind of carefully crafted narrative that profoundly benefits whiteness and the Canadian nation, that lumps, right, just lumps uncritically Black people into a kind of amorphous category of the settler. And this narrative, in order to do that, marks Blackness as either a recent post-1960s migrant experience, right, which Bonita just so clearly challenged in her response. So marks us either as this kind of post-1960s migrant group of later arrivals, or as coming to Canada historically only as part of an Underground Railroad arrival story. So again, two kinds of arrival stories that ignore the deeply entrenched histories of chattel slavery, not only in the Americas, but in Canada, and the violent nature of that system of enslavement. And erases, right, not only the presence of Black people, but again, as Bonita says, the long history of collaboration between Indigenous and Black communities. The maintenance of this kind of narrative is important for a number of reasons, right? Because it indemnifies the Canadian nation against any claim of reparative justice for Black peoples by making us invisible, right, within the context of Canadian history, within Canada's history of African enslavement. But by doing this, it also occludes the fact that the ongoing project of colonization, again, as Bonita argued, the ongoing project of colonization, as well as, you know, with its violence against Indigenous peoples and Indigenous knowledge systems, is not separate from violence against Black people. These systems are actually deeply bound up in the violence of chattel slavery, anti-Black racism, and global capitalism. All of these systems emerge out of the same impulses. So Tiffany King, in her book, The Black Shoals, argues that when we recognize that the practice of enslaving Black people, so stripping them of their humanity, transforming them into chattel, happened alongside and in relationship to Indigenous genocide, to Indigenous loss, to Indigenous theft, then we have to accept that Black on freedom is also a form of conquest, that Black and Indigenous death, right, the death we noted in our joint statements, right, that continues to take place, emerge out of the same colonial desires. The self-actualization of the settler identity actually depends on the most virulent forms, the most violent forms of Black and Indigenous death. And for me, as a Black woman who is a descendant of Africans enslaved in the Americas, it's very important that we acknowledge that even if at some point, some moment, I were to occupy some position of the settler, then it would have to look very, very different from how we understand a white settler. Having said that, I also think it's important to acknowledge, right, that to acknowledge the ways in which these colonial structures also function to encourage and maintain a kind of competitive citizenship or a competitive model of belonging that separates the interests, that seeks to separate the interests of non-white groups. So there's a way in which the capitalist structure, for example, by promising some brown and some Black people a small piece of the pie, right? By offering them entrance into the middle class, for example, by dangling the Canadian dream as a reward to the good Negro or the good minority, that these colonial structures also deliberately, right, work to reduce the possibilities for resistance and in that way maintain their own dominance. So, because the envelope that they're willing to share is so small, right? Racialized communities, non-white communities, brown and Black communities find themselves fighting against each other for whatever gains they can achieve. And this keeps us preoccupied, right? With when we get a little piece of this pie to hold on to it, to safeguard our own, right, what's perceived as our own self-interest. And so we become kind of myopic in a way that is not useful. So I think, so it becomes a kind of zero-sum game, right, where one community or one group can only win if another group loses. And I think that oppressed people, so Indigenous peoples, Black and other racialized groups and women need to begin to refuse, and I think we are beginning to do that, to refuse that kind of co-optation and begin to imagine different ways of relating to each other and relating across our differences that is not rooted in these competitive models of survival.
I feel like you've segued right into our next question and the conversations about such. So my next question was, how do these colonial mechanisms and Black Indigenous responses overlap, intersect, and disrupt the notion of single issue activism?
Who wants to go first?
Let's go first.
I'll let you go first, Andrea.
So I'm going to come to this from maybe a slightly surprising way and then work my way back around. So I think it's important to acknowledge, first of all, that sometimes single issue activism is important, right? That sometimes Indigenous peoples need to stand up and say, these are our concerns and they need to be addressed and we need to push these forward. After the 1960s, Black women needed to define Black feminisms as a set of ideologies that was discrete from white feminism. And sometimes Black women need to separate the interests of gender from the goals, the wider goals of Black protest movements. And as we reflect, right, because we are here, right, because of the present moment in which we stand and the present moment that we share. So in this particular moment that started with the sounds and images of violence against, against Black men specifically, and then spurred us to consider the ways in which this was endemic and widespread. I think that in this moment, it is important for us to acknowledge the specific contours of anti-Black racism, to acknowledge those unapologetically. At the same time, though, what makes this moment so profound, so powerful, what makes it feel so different, and I don't know, honestly, that any of us in our lifetime can say that we've seen a response in exactly this way, and certainly not during a pandemic, right, where people are putting their lives at risk. So what makes this moment so powerful is the way that it has galvanized diverse groups and communities into solidarity with Black communities across race, geographic boundaries, gender, sexualities, religion, etc. And this has, for me, in many ways, it's often those images of solidarity that brought me to tears in a weird kind of way, right? Because there was a way I could insulate myself from some of the violence by not watching the videos, or because I had been there and done that and imagined that already. But there's something about the coming together in this moment that does me, right, in unexpected moments. So I think, for example, of the Aztec cleansing ceremony that took place in Houston before a protest in that city to prepare the ground, right? So that the protesters could be blessed and protected on that particular night. That was profoundly meaningful to me, right? That we were sharing not just space, but joining, right? Joining hands, joining hearts, joining our imaginations to think about a different kind of world. And across Canada, from British Columbia, to Ontario, and elsewhere, Indigenous communities and Black communities have been coming together, right? Joining together in these protests against violence in all of its forms, including violence against Black and Indigenous men. Two, I think, grade 9 students in Sudbury organized a protest there. In Toronto, protesters galvanized against anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racisms following the death of Regis Korkinski Paquette. So, and there are too many of these instances of solidarity to name them all.
I'm sorry, but somehow I turned it off. Now I'll turn it off again. Let's see if it works. My apologies.
What I think we're seeing is a greater recognition of the intersections of anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism and the responsibility of our multiple communities to take individual and group accountability. So I'll leave that there. Bonita, you go.
Yeah, I mean, the moment that I saw that moved me as much as the Aztec ceremony was a march in Yellowknife. Because of course, I think what's galvanized the anger, the tremendous determination to end the murders of Black people across the United States has been the fact that it's happening in different places. So everybody picks up on their local, circumstances. And in Yellowknife, where primarily the people marching were Native, and they were all carrying Black Lives Matter banners, which are really important, including one that made me laugh because it was saying, "Bitch, Black Lives Matter, recognize it," right? Which, you don't usually think of for Yellowknife Native people to be saying that, right? But the other thing is that many of the Black people who spoke were Africans, had landed from Africa. And so they were addressing, questions of I think it was Cameroon and, I can't remember the different nations. And Native people were saying things like, we are sick of being kicked around by the cops. So they were protesting Black Lives Matter against the violence they were facing and a recognition of the violence that the African migrants who were living there were facing. And it was just a tremendous kind of merging and mingling and, distinct and yet mingling that really moved me, I'm not sure what else I can say about that either. I think you've kind of framed it really well, and I'll leave it at that.
Excellent, thank you. As we look at the experiences of standing in solidarity, I think to Madison, our beautiful little one, who is bravely, brilliantly carrying those both identities. I met Madison as she was with my children, two my Indigenous children, in an Aboriginal Head Start program. So a program for children, Indigenous children, to build their identities and solid understandings of themselves in a culturally respectful space. And I also know that that beautiful child gets to celebrate and understand who she is as a young Black person, as she spends many summers, past couple summers, engaging in the Freedom School through Black Lives Matter. And this dual identity that so many community members have carried, as Benita has clearly discussed, for hundreds of years, there has been a community of Black Indigenous people, Indigenous Black people, inseparable identities. And I think that we are at a point where we see each other not just as another group to stand in solidarity with, but our families and our community members that we need to support and hold dear and accountable, and that know that, or account to them, so that we can continue to live. So from your own experiences, as I said to Madison publicly, that it's my responsibility as an auntie to make sure that her strawberry tree keeps flourishing, that, I give water, I give love. From your own experiences, how can Black and Indigenous communities stand together and do that solidarity work?
Well, you were also talking about Black Indigenous people, correct? Yeah. Because I think that, and here it's really important that Native peoples take up Black Lives Matter, because anti-Black racism in Native communities has been a reality. It's entered our communities. It's ironic because I think it enters our communities at the cusp of intermarriage. Because, for example, my mother's generation, most of the people she brought home from work were Black people or some South Asian people. They were the only people who she could identify with, right, as a Native woman in 1960s Montreal. So I think there's been long histories of solidarity between communities, but what happens when the children of those unions, and some of it has to do with the policing of one another, the challenges to our indigeneity that people love to fight about. I think of all the Native student groups who have really, I think it's happening less now, but I remember when I was a student, how often this group didn't feel that they were welcome there. They weren't Native enough, this sort of thing. So in many respects, too often at powwows, Black Native people, are they Native? And that's partly anti-Black racism, and that's partly that exclusionary focus of who's Native and who isn't, but it's the thing that's the brunt that the Black Native child faces, right? And I don't want to downplay that. It's important to talk about solidarity, but it's also important to talk about how often Black Native people at powwows are like, what are they doing here? you know?
Mhm.
So that, I'm hoping that the recognition of Black Lives Matter by Native people is going to start to do that. But in some ways, it's been the policing of our own identities by the Indian Act that I think has been the seed that created these exclusionary things, as well as the entry of racism into our communities generally because of that. On the other hand, I mean, so many things make for differences. If you have Indian status, Black people with Indian status who can live in Native communities. I mean, a colleague of ours has joked and said that in her Cree community in Northern Alberta now there are 8 Black Native families, and it's usually Black men marrying Native women, and they're joking that we're going to be taking over now, you know, and that it is a good relationship to be able to joke about that, you know. So in other words, they're not a threat, right? And they can joke about we're going to be we're moving in and we're not going. So I think that when Black Native children have Indian status, it creates a different kind of dynamic. When Black Native people speak their Indigenous language, I remember a Choctaw Black Native man who, and his history talks so much about the intersections of our histories, because he said, how can I not be Choctaw when I speak Choctaw, right? And then he talked about how older, the previous generation of Choctaw men and women had been kidnapped back into slavery as Black people, you know. So that deep history, which you see more in the US than you see in Canada, that deep history, except in the Maritimes. And it's only recently in the Maritimes that Black Native communities are beginning to explore what this means, you know. So, yeah. I don't know, I think, do you want to speak, Andrea?
Yes. I absolutely agree with you, and thank you very much for, you know, for that honesty, because, you know, we can be anti-racist doesn't mean that we're right. You know, we can be anti-racist and still be anti-Black, right? And that is something that those of us doing this kind of work, this, you know, advance in scholarship and teaching in ways that we believe can create the possibilities for a better world have to acknowledge. And for me, a lot of it, right? How Black and Indigenous communities can stand together and work in solidarity. A lot of this has to do with relationality, right? That we have to approach each other from a position of relationality, and search for ways of living with, beside, in partnership with each other that refuses and exceeds the terms offered to us by the nation. So recognizing, you know, when we recognize the entanglements of the oppressive forces in Indigenous theft and what Tiffany King calls Black fungibility, then as Black scholars, because that's who we are, but also as Indigenous scholars, as artists, as activists, as feminists, we have to write, think, be prepared to write, think, and live from a position of relationality, and develop or seek to develop a kind of joint Indigenous and Black ethics of care, and think carefully and thoughtfully about what that might look like. You know, and Black people in particular, and other racialized groups, but Black and brown people have to be prepared to resist, right? To reject any invitation to participate in the ongoing violence of Indigenous and Black conquest, and refuse participation in the goals of heteropatriarchy and the goals of neoliberal capitalism, because those systems were not set up to benefit any of us, right? they're destructive. All of them are designed to destroy us at the core, at worst to destroy us, at best to manage us. And since the histories of colonial theft and chattel slavery, as we've agreed today, continue to perpetrate systems of violence against Indigenous and Black people, then Black and Indigenous scholars need to acknowledge, right, a joint responsibility to critique the hegemonic nation, to critique the neoliberal university even, and to refuse their imperialist, patriarchal, and capitalist impulses. And to be prepared individually, not just collectively, but individually, to be self-reflexive and to name what we see, which is why I appreciate so much what Benita just said. And not just to talk, not just to have webinars, but to look for ways to advance collaboration, which is something I hope, Benita, now that the Indigenous Studies program is moving to humanities, that we can do together some of that work between the Indigenous Studies program and the Black Canadian Studies certificate.
Andrea, you always set up my next question so perfectly. I can't give more love than that. So my next question is, you both have provided people a lot to think about. And I know due to colonial education, many people have questions right now. And I knew that even as starting conversation, we were not going to have time. But I know both of you teach and bring this knowledge forward. So are there courses that either of you teach or writings that you would want to share that discuss the intersection of Black and Indigenous identities, relations, and solidarities that you would like to leave people with?
Well, I guess, the first thing I want to say is that I remember almost 10 years ago when Zainab Amadi and I co-wrote a paper, Indigenous People and Black People, Settlers or Allies. I think the conversation has moved on from there. And I remember critiques of people such as Ronaldo Walcott saying, what about Black fungibility? What about labor? What about Canada's role as an imperialist nation? And I want to acknowledge all that and say that some of these conversations that we've taken up in the early days have been exceeded and moved on from, and I think it's a really good thing. I do teach a course. The label came from the US, Black Indians and Native Black Relations. I started teaching the course after attending the first Native American and Indigenous Studies conference that was held in Oklahoma, and discovering the deeply rooted antipathies coming from Cherokee people against Black Native people. That shocked me to death. I mean, as I say, I've seen the are you Native or not? The Black Native person at the powwow. But this is historical, rooted in the fact that the four nations that were developed on lands that were taken for slavery took African slaves, that long history. When I saw that, I said, I have to make a course on this. So I created this course called Black Indians and Native Black Relations, and I've been anxious to change the title, but in equity studies, that didn't happen. It's gonna happen in humanities. But the point is, it's a survey course, and it focuses on both historical and geographic, basically across the Americas, as much as can be written. So we start with questions of both genocide and slavery. We do a long section on rethinking slavery, which is, for example, the huge extent of slavery in Brazil, and that most slaves went to Latin America, focusing on the triangular trade in the Caribbean with Britain. And why was it that the San Domingo was so successful as a slave uprising against French colonialism, while Jamaica did not succeed in their attempt to become an independent nation, right, with the British? We look at the indigenous slave trade and also indigenous resistance to slavery that took place in the Caribbean. So that whole section on rethinking slavery, then we start to look at questions of what happened with the end of slavery and the beginning of settler nations, and what are the different ways in which that affected Black and Native people. exclusions of Black peoples, genocide, like that's when Native people become the Indian problem to be removed. So all of those things get addressed. We look a lot at Indigenous peoples in the Caribbean and those relations. And also finally, the tremendous moments of solidarity, the Black Panther Party and the American Indian Movement, etc. Finally, we look at Indigenous Black relations in Canada, and it's harder to focus on that in a course because a lot of it hasn't been written yet. There are people wanting to write those histories now from Black communities in the Maritimes, but they're not, most of them aren't in print yet. So it's a discourse that hasn't been written as much in Canada for various reasons. So it's a really wonderful survey course, and it's very reading heavy, but I think it's excellent. Humanities, well, I don't know if Andrea, if you want to talk about the kind of courses that Vermont is teaching, for example, or other courses that you're teaching. That's what I have to offer.
So we do, you're right. We do have some courses taught by Vermont Alston, who is a colleague who is Black and Indigenous, that looks at the intersections or a range of literatures, from multiple perspectives in the department. And those are already all cross-listed with the Indigenous Studies program. I don't teach a course like that specifically, although in my first year course, Cultures of Resistance in the Americas, I hope that my students leave understanding that Black people's relationships or experiences are interrelated and interconnected, and that the structures that are made to bear, that come to bear against Black life are not singular in their pursuit, right? And those same systems are also made to bear against other groups, other oppressed peoples, Indigenous peoples, women, and so on. I am currently about to start my sabbatical and to go back to look at the reviews for a book that I'm working on, Horizon Sea Sound, that you mentioned, Ruth. And in that book, I'm trying to think deeply about what I've been calling relationality and what that looks like. And I come to this work through literature. So Black women's literature in Canada, the Caribbean, and the United States. And to think about what it means for me as a Black woman, but also a Black Jamaican woman, to live in Canada, to work in Canada, to take up space in Canada, and what do I accept, what do I take, and what must I refuse, and how can I think about a kind of Black future that doesn't deny other possibilities of life. And so that's an ongoing reflection for me that won't end, I'm sure, with this book. But that has started nonetheless, and I appreciate very much, the kinds of work that Benita has done in the past and the way the narrative has allowed itself to shift, to recognize some of the concerns that I raised earlier. So I'm really thankful to be able within the Academy to do some of that work.
Thank you both so very much. I know that people will be discussing this conversation for a while. I'm glad that we will be able to share it with others as it's been recorded. I also want to give a quick little plug to my good friends, Rodney, Sandy, and Sirius, in their book that they created, Until We Are Free, Reflections of Black Lives Matter in Canada, in which there are co-written chapters between Indigenous and Black activists, including Giselle Days and Leanne Simpson. So I want to just put that out there as a great new resource. It's brand new. I haven't even read it myself. So I want to just offer the last moment of conversation and thanks to both of you, and ask Sheila if she had anything she wanted to say. I'm sorry it's so close to the end.
That's okay. But I do want to say, Miigwech, thank you so much for that very, very rich dialogue. I think it's so critical for us to understand these intersections as well as interlocking oppressions experienced by both Indigenous and Black peoples. I think you both provided us with a really good critical lens for us to start reimagining our understandings of how colonialism continues to divide and conquer Indigenous and Black communities through the ongoing perpetuation of key particular narratives, as Bonita said earlier, that not only reduce but dehumanize people and erase us both from the history of this country. Thank you for providing that rich perspective on the importance of working together in solidarity. I've gone away myself. I'm going to be going away with learnings. And so I find that so fantastic as well. Many, many thanks to you both for sharing your experiences. I'm so grateful to have colleagues like you at York University. And I'll be reaching out. And many thanks to Professor Ruth Kulzer-Green, who's going on sabbatical shortly, a well-deserved sabbatical. Thank you for organizing and facilitating this important discussion. Your ideas and bringing people together have been so critical in moving this university to a different place. And thank you finally also to Madison for sharing with us today. I really enjoyed the diverse views, but also the range of perspectives from the youth to people who have a lot of experience in academia. So Miigwech, thank you, Niawan.
Thank you both so very much. Thank you, Sheila, for hosting and supporting this event and being somebody who, all three of you, somebody I can look up to. So thank you for doing work that is important. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And thanks to
Yeah.
the participants.
Yeah.
And
Miigwech.
thank you for all that have
Alan.
stayed with us.
Yeah.
We've had almost 150 people this whole time. So thank you.
Okay.